Margaret was known as a force of nature in the business world, sharp, strategic, and uncompromising. Since Charles's passing, she had single-handedly kept their empire thriving, ensuring it continued to grow despite the challenges of leadership. Yet, beneath her polished exterior, Margaret carried a deep loneliness that few could fathom. Her mansion, once filled with laughter and lively debates with Charles, now felt like an empty shell. The business, though thriving, no longer brought her the joy it once had. She kept her emotions hidden, her sharp eyes and precise words shielding her from vulnerability. To the outside world, Margaret Elwood was invincible. But in the quiet moments, when the city's buzz faded and she was left alone with her thoughts, she felt the weight of her solitude. Across the bustling office floors of Elwood Corporation, Tom Hensley quietly went about his work. The janitor's uniform he wore was a little worn, and his cap, frayed at the edges, rarely left his head. To most of the employees rushing between meetings or huddled over presentations, Tom was almost invisible, a fixture of the building rather than a person with a story. But Tom didn't mind. He found comfort in his routine. With every polished floor and emptied trash bin, he felt a sense of purpose. He enjoyed the rhythm of his work and the chance to observe the intricate dance of office life. While the executives debated stock projections and mergers, Tom noticed the small details. He saw the weariness in their eyes, the subtle dynamics of power at play in their meetings, and the rare moments of kindness that punctuated the corporate grind. For over 20 years, he had watched the company evolve, always content to remain in the background. What Tom didn't know was that Margaret had noticed him too. That evening, as the office began to quiet and the last of the employees trickled out, Tom was mopping the marble floors near the executive suite. The sound of his mop gliding over the tiles echoed softly in the empty hallway. He was just about to finish up and head home when he heard the unmistakable click of heels approaching. Looking up, Tom saw Margaret Elwood herself walking toward him. Her presence was commanding, and for a moment Tom froze, unsure of why she was there. Margaret rarely ventured into the quieter corners of her building, and even less so to speak with someone like him. "Mr. Hensley," Margaret said, her voice calm yet deliberate. Tom quickly removed his cap, a reflex of respect. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice steady despite his surprise. Margaret paused, as if carefully choosing her words. Her gaze softened, a stark contrast to the sharpness most people associated with her. "I need to ask you for a favor." Tom blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "A favor? From me?" "Yes," Margaret said, her expression thoughtful. "There's a critical meeting tomorrow, a negotiation that could significantly impact this company. I'd like you to attend it with me." Tom's mouth fell open slightly, and he quickly shook his head in disbelief. "Ma'am, I think you might be mistaken. I'm just the janitor. I don't know the first thing about business meetings or negotiations." Margaret's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "That's exactly why I'm asking you, Tom. You've been here for decades. You observe things others don't. I need someone I can trust, someone who sees clearly and isn't swayed by the games people play in those rooms." Tom hesitated, still trying to process her words. But why me? There are plenty of people in this company who are smarter, better dressed, and more qualified. Margaret took a step closer, her gaze steady. "Because you're honest, and because Charles always said that the heart of this company wasn't in its boardroom, but in the people who worked quietly to keep it standing. He believed in people like you, Tom. I'm starting to think he was right." Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply with Tom. He thought back to the rare moments when Charles Elwood had stopped to chat with him, always kind and respectful, even as the busy CEO. Those memories stirred something inside him, a sense of pride he hadn't felt in years. After a long pause, Tom nodded slowly. "All right," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I'll do it." Margaret's smile widened, a genuine expression of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Tom. I promise you won't regret it." As she walked away, Tom stood there, mop in hand, still trying to wrap his mind around what had just happened. Tomorrow he would step into a world he had only observed from the edges, alongside the most powerful woman in the city. And though he didn't know it yet, everything was about to change. The next morning dawned with an uneasy stillness for Tom Hensley. He stood in front of his small bathroom mirror staring at his reflection. His usual work uniform hung on the back of the door, freshly pressed as always, but it didn't feel right for what lay ahead. Margaret Elwood had asked him to join her at a high-stakes business meeting, and the weight of her request sat heavily on his shoulders. Tom sighed, reaching for the old button-down shirt he hadn't worn in years. It was a little snug around the shoulders, and the collar had lost its crispness, but it was the closest thing he had to business attire. His reflection looked back at him with uncertainty. "You're just the janitor," he muttered. "What good can you do in a room full of suits?" But deep down, he knew there was no turning back. Margaret had trusted him, her words echoing in his mind. "I need someone who sees clearly, someone I can trust." With his cap firmly on his head, Tom grabbed his keys and stepped out of his modest apartment. The crisp morning air hit his face as he made his way to the towering Elwood Corporation building. Inside the gleaming office, Margaret was already in her private conference room, reviewing papers and preparing for the meeting. Her usual sharp focus was tinged with a rare flicker of unease. Inviting Tom had been a bold choice, and she couldn't shake the nagging doubt about whether it had been the right one. Yet, as she thought of her late husband's belief in trusting people like Tom, people who weren't swayed by power or ambition, her resolve strengthened. When Tom arrived, he hesitated at the entrance to the conference room. The polished glass doors loomed large, reflecting his unsure expression back at him. Taking a deep breath, he pushed them open. Margaret looked up, her sharp eyes softening slightly as she saw him. "Good morning, Tom," she said, motioning for him to sit at the table. "Good morning, ma'am," Tom replied, clutching his cap nervously as he eased into one of the sleek leather chairs. The luxurious setting felt alien, and he couldn't help but feel like he didn't belong. "I still don't know what you expect me to do here. I don't know the first thing about business." Margaret smiled faintly, her expression calm but deliberate. "I don't need you to know business, Tom. I need you to see people, just like you always do." Tom furrowed his brow, unsure of what she meant, but he nodded all the same. "I'll do my best." Margaret leaned forward, her voice dropping to a more personal tone. "Do you know why Charles always made time to talk to you even when he was CEO?" Tom shook his head. "I just thought he was a kind man." "He was," Margaret agreed. "But he also had a gift for seeing value where others didn't. He admired your honesty and humility. He often told me that the people who work quietly in the background see more than anyone else because they aren't caught up in the noise." Tom blinked, her words settling in like a puzzle piece clicking into place. He had never thought of himself that way before, but now, sitting across from the most powerful woman in the city, he felt a small flicker of confidence begin to take root. The meeting room was a stark contrast to Tom's usual environment. The polished table stretched across the space, surrounded by high-backed chairs that looked as imposing as the executives who would soon fill them. The panoramic windows offered a breathtaking view of the city, though Tom barely noticed. His focus was on keeping his hands from trembling. As the clock approached 10, Margaret stood smoothing her blazer. "The others will be here soon. Stay by my side, and remember, your perspective matters." Tom nodded, swallowing hard as the sound of approaching footsteps echoed in the hallway. The doors opened and a group of sharply dressed executives filed in, their confident strides filling the room with an air of authority. Among them was Victor Blackwell, a man whose presence demanded attention. His tailored suit, slicked-back hair, and easy smirk exuded self-assuredness. Tom felt an immediate unease as Victor's sharp eyes swept the room, pausing briefly on him before dismissing him entirely. Victor extended a hand to Margaret. "Margaret Elwood," he said with a smooth grin. "Always a pleasure." "Victor," Margaret replied coolly, shaking his hand. "Let's get started." The executives took their seats, their assistants bustling behind them with notepads and laptops. Tom stood awkwardly behind Margaret, feeling the weight of curious glances and whispered remarks. "What's a janitor doing here?" he imagined them saying, but Margaret's calm presence kept him grounded. As the meeting began, Victor launched into a polished presentation, his voice smooth and persuasive. He spoke of projections and profits, throwing out terms that made Tom's head spin. But Margaret's expression remained neutral, her eyes sharp and unyielding. Tom, on the other hand, observed everything. The way Victor leaned back in his chair with exaggerated ease, the assistant's hurried notes that seemed more like damage control, and the subtle shift in Margaret's posture when Victor brought up certain figures. It was clear to him that Victor was trying to overwhelm Margaret with a flood of jargon, but she wasn't biting. Despite the intimidating atmosphere, Tom's instincts sharpened. He didn't understand the numbers or the business jargon, but he knew people, and something about Victor Blackwell felt off. As the discussion continued, Tom caught sight of something unusual, a piece of paper partially hidden beneath Victor's briefcase. It was just a sliver, but enough to catch his attention. His pulse quickened. What was it? Why was it tucked away? He debated whether to speak up, his nerves battling his instincts. Margaret's words echoed in his mind. Your perspective matters. Finally, he took a deep breath and leaned forward. Excuse me, he said, his voice shaky but determined. All eyes turned to him, the room falling silent. Victor's smile faltered, annoyance flashing in his eyes. Yes, he asked, his tone cold. Tom pointed to the briefcase. There's a paper under there. I think you might want to take a look at it. The tension in the room thickened as Margaret's gaze shifted to the briefcase. Her voice was calm but firm. Victor, would you mind moving your briefcase? Victor hesitated, his confident facade cracking ever so slightly. Slowly, he slid the briefcase aside, revealing the hidden document. Margaret reached for it, her sharp eyes scanning the contents. Tom held his breath as her expression hardened. The atmosphere shifted, and everyone in the room felt the weight of the revelation about to unfold. The room was silent as Margaret Elwood read the document that had been hidden beneath Victor Blackwell's briefcase. The tension was so thick that Tom Hensley felt like he could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. He had no idea what was on that piece of paper, but judging by the way Margaret's expression shifted, her calm, composed demeanor tightening into something sharper, he knew it wasn't good. Victor Blackwell cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the situation. I'm sure whatever that is, it's just an oversight, he said, his voice smooth but tinged with unease. Margaret slowly set the document down on the polished table. An oversight, she repeated, her tone quiet but laced with steel. She tapped the paper with one manicured finger. This oversight would have given your firm significant control over our supply chain, leaving us vulnerable to inflated costs and limited production capacity, and yet you didn't mention this during your presentation, Victor. Victor's smile faltered. Margaret, I can assure you— Stop. Margaret's voice cut through the room like a whip. Do not insult my intelligence by pretending this was an accident. Tom shifted uncomfortably behind her, feeling the weight of the moment. The other executives in the room exchanged uneasy glances, unsure where to look. Victor's assistant, seated a few chairs away, kept her gaze firmly on her notepad, scribbling furiously. Margaret stood, taking the document in her hands and walking slowly around the table. The room was still, everyone's eyes following her as she circled, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Let me make one thing clear, she began, her voice steady and commanding. This company was built on integrity, by my husband and me, brick by brick, deal by deal. I have no patience for deception, no tolerance for shortcuts. She stopped directly across from Victor, her piercing gaze locking onto his. And no room for people like you. Victor sat back, attempting to project confidence, but the color had drained from his face. Margaret, You lied, Margaret interrupted, her voice rising just enough to make the room vibrate with authority. You tried to manipulate me, my team, and this company for your gain. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think I wouldn't find out? Victor's mouth opened, but no words came out. The power dynamic in the room had shifted entirely, and Margaret was now firmly in control. As Margaret spoke, Tom couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. He had spent years feeling invisible, just the janitor in the background. Yet today his small observation had made a difference. He had stood up and pointed out what others had overlooked, and now he was witnessing Margaret dismantle Victor's schemes with the precision of a surgeon. Margaret turned to face the rest of the executives. "This is exactly why I needed someone like Tom here," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "Someone who sees clearly, without the distractions of jargon or ego. While some of you were too busy nodding along to Victor's performance, Tom noticed what truly mattered." Tom blinked in surprise as the room's attention shifted to him. He felt his face flush under their gazes, some impressed, others skeptical. But Margaret's words filled him with a sense of validation he hadn't felt in years. "Tom," Margaret said, turning to him with a rare smile, "you've reminded me that success isn't about who shouts the loudest. It's about who listens, who observes, and who stands for what's right. For that, I thank you." Tom's throat tightened, but he managed a quiet, "Thank you, ma'am." Victor, meanwhile, was squirming in his seat. "Margaret," he began again, his voice desperate, "let's not overreact. I'm sure we can find a way to move forward." Margaret raised a hand, silencing him. "There is no moving forward, Victor. Not with you. Security will escort you out, effective immediately." At her words, 2 security personnel stepped into the room. Victor rose slowly, his face a mixture of humiliation and disbelief. "You're making a mistake," he muttered as they guided him toward the door. "No, Victor," Margaret replied, her tone icy. "I'm correcting one." As the doors closed behind him, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. The executives who had been silently observing seemed to sit up straighter, as if realizing that Margaret's leadership was not to be underestimated. Tom noticed some of them glancing at him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and newfound respect. Margaret returned to her seat and faced the group. "Let this be a lesson to all of us," she said. "Trust is the foundation of this company. Deception will never be tolerated here. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever." She paused, letting her words sink in. "And as for Tom," she added, turning to him again, "his honesty and courage today saved us from a disastrous mistake. I hope you all remember that integrity doesn't come from titles or suits. It comes from within." Tom felt his chest swell with a mixture of pride and humility. He had spent so many years blending into the background, never imagining that he could play a role in something so important. Yet here he was, standing alongside Margaret Elwood, proving that even the quietest voices could make an impact. As the meeting adjourned, Margaret placed a hand on Tom's shoulder. "Come by my office later," she said softly. "I have a proposition for you." Tom nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of confidence, a sense that he wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was someone who mattered. Tom Hensley sat in the corner of Margaret's spacious office later that afternoon, his thoughts still swirling from the events of the meeting. Margaret sat at her large oak desk, reviewing the document that had nearly cost her company everything. Her sharp eyes scanned every line of text, her brows furrowing deeper with each passing moment. "You were right to speak up," Margaret said finally, breaking the silence. She didn't look up, but her tone was firm and sincere. "If you hadn't noticed that paper, we'd be in serious trouble right now." Tom shifted in his seat, clutching his worn cap in his hands. "I didn't do much," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just saw something that didn't sit right." Margaret set the paper down and leaned back in her chair, fixing Tom with a steady gaze. "That's more than most people would have done," she said. "It's easy to overlook the little things, especially in a room full of big egos. But you didn't. And because of that, you saved us from making a very costly mistake." Tom's mind wandered back to the moment he had spotted the edge of the paper peeking out from under Victor's sleek leather briefcase. He had hesitated, unsure if it was his place to say anything. But something about the way Victor had carried himself, the smug confidence, the overly polished words, had made Tom's instincts scream that something wasn't right. It wasn't an easy decision to speak up. Tom had spent years staying out of sight, blending into the background of a company that barely noticed him. But in that moment, he had realized that staying silent wasn't an option. I didn't want you to get cheated," Tom said finally, his voice breaking the quiet. "This company, it's your life, and I guess I couldn't stand the thought of someone taking advantage of that." Margaret's expression softened. For a moment, the businesswoman's sharp edges gave way to something more human, something vulnerable. "You remind me of someone," she said, her voice tinged with emotion. "My husband. He always believed in people and their ability to do the right thing when it mattered most." Margaret rose from her chair and walked to the window, gazing out at the city skyline. "When we started this company, we didn't have much. Just a dream and a lot of determination. My husband used to say that success wasn't about money or power. It was about trust. Trust in each other and trust in the people we worked with." Tom listened quietly, feeling a lump form in his throat. He had never heard Margaret speak so openly before. She was always poised, always in control. But now, there was a sadness in her voice that he hadn't expected. "When he passed," Margaret continued, "I felt like I had to take on the world alone, to prove that I could do it without him. But somewhere along the way, I forgot what he taught me. I started trusting contracts more than people, spreadsheets more than instincts." She turned to face Tom, her gaze steady but warm. "And then today, you reminded me of what I've been missing." Tom fidgeted with his cap, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't used to being at the center of attention, let alone receiving praise from someone like Margaret. "I just did what anyone would have done," he said finally. Margaret smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. "That's where you're wrong, Tom. Most people wouldn't have said a word. They would have assumed it wasn't their place, or they would have been too afraid to rock the boat, but you had the courage to speak up, and that's something I won't forget." "How would you feel about taking on a new role here?" Margaret asked, her eyes searching his for a reaction. "Something that goes beyond cleaning floors and emptying trash bins." Tom blinked, stunned. "A new role? I don't know what to say," Margaret smiled. "You don't have to decide right now. But I'd like to offer you a position as my advisor, someone I can trust to give me an honest perspective, free from the usual corporate pretenses. You've spent years observing this company from a unique vantage point, and I believe that insight is invaluable." Tom stared at her, his mind racing. He had never imagined something like this. For years he had been content with his quiet, unassuming life. But now, he was being offered a chance to step into a world he had only watched from the sidelines. "I'm just a janitor," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret leaned forward, her expression kind but firm. "You're much more than that, Tom. You've shown me that sometimes the greatest strengths come from the most unexpected places. This isn't about titles or resumes. It's about trust. And I trust you." For a long moment, Tom said nothing. Then slowly, a small smile spread across his face. "If you think I can help, Mrs. Elwood, I'll do my best." Margaret extended her hand, and Tom shook it firmly. "I have no doubt about that, Tom." As Tom left the office, a sense of purpose filled him. He wasn't just the janitor anymore. He was someone who mattered, someone who could make a difference. And for the first time in years, he felt truly seen. Meanwhile, Margaret sat back in her chair, a feeling of hope settling over her. She had faced many challenges as the head of her company, but this one felt different. In Tom, she had found not just an ally, but a reminder of what truly mattered. The weeks following Victor Blackwell's downfall were transformative for Margaret Elwood's company. The revelation of his deceit had shaken the boardroom to its core, but it had also sparked a renewed sense of purpose. Margaret seized the opportunity to lead her company into a new era, one grounded in integrity, transparency, and inclusivity. Margaret's first order of business was to address the company as a whole. In an all-hands meeting held in the expansive atrium, she stood before her employees, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "For too long," she began, "we've allowed divisions to grow within our walls, divisions between executives and staff, between those who are seen and those who are not. That ends today." The room was silent as she continued, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. "This company was built on values my husband and I held dear: honesty, respect, and teamwork. It's time we return to those roots." Margaret announced a series of reforms, including initiatives to bridge the gap between leadership and staff. One of the key changes was the creation of an employee advisory board, where representatives from every department, including maintenance and janitorial, could voice their concerns and ideas. Tom Hensley was the first to be named to the board. At first, Tom felt out of place in the boardroom meetings. Surrounded by professionals in suits and polished shoes, he wondered if he truly belonged. But Margaret's faith in him never wavered. With her encouragement, he began to speak up, sharing observations that often went unnoticed by others. "Tom has an eye for details most of us overlook," Margaret told the board during one meeting. "His perspective has already saved us from one catastrophe. I suggest we listen." Slowly, the skepticism in the room gave way to respect. Tom's honesty and practicality became a cornerstone of the advisory board's discussions, earning him admiration from even the most senior executives. Inspired by Tom's humility and Margaret's leadership, the company began to change. Training programs focused on empathy and collaboration were introduced. Margaret also implemented policies to recognize and reward contributions from every level of the organization. The changes extended beyond internal operations. Margaret launched a community outreach program aimed at supporting underprivileged families and providing career opportunities to those in need. The program was aptly named Elwood Bridges, symbolizing the connections being built both within and outside the company. One evening, Margaret and Tom stood side by side in the company's rooftop garden, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. It had been a long day, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the air. "You've come a long way, Tom," Margaret said, breaking the silence. "I hope you know how much of this is because of you." Tom chuckled, shaking his head. "I just pointed out a piece of paper, Mrs. Elwood. You did the rest." Margaret turned to him, her expression serious. "You did more than that. You reminded me, and everyone else, that greatness doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it wears a dusty cap and carries a mop." Tom smiled, his heart swelling with pride. For years he had felt invisible, but now he was part of something much bigger than himself. Months turned into years, and Margaret's company thrived under its new ethos. Employees across all departments felt a renewed sense of belonging, and the business's reputation soared. Margaret and Tom's story became a legend within the company, a reminder that leadership isn't about titles, but about values. Tom eventually retired, but not before leaving an indelible mark on the organization. In his honor, Margaret established the Tom Hensley Award, given annually to employees who exemplified integrity, humility, and dedication. On the anniversary of her husband's passing, Margaret sat alone in her office, a framed photograph of the two of them on her desk. She thought about how far the company had come, how it had evolved into something that would have made her husband proud. Her gaze shifted to another photo on the wall, a group picture of the advisory board, with Tom standing in the center, his familiar cap perched on his head. She smiled, her heart filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered softly, not just to her husband, but to the janitor who had taught her the true meaning of leadership. Margaret Elwood's journey reminds us that true success isn't measured by wealth or power, but by the connections we forge and the values we uphold. Her story, and Tom's role in it, is a testament to the transformative power of trust and humility. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that greatness can come from the most unexpected places. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more inspiring stories. Let's celebrate the power of humanity together.